But it would take more than ordinary police repression to break the determination of Marseille's 80,000 striking workers. If the U.S. was to have its victory in Marseille, it would have to fight for it, and the CIA proceeded to do just that. Through their contacts with the Socialist Party, the CIA had sent agents and a psychological warfare team to Marseille, where they dealt directly with Corsican syndicate leaders through the Guerini brothers. The CIA's operatives supplied arms and money to Corsican gangs for assaults on communist picket lines and harassment of the important union officials. During the month-long strike, the CIA's gangsters and the purged CRS police units murdered a number of striking workers and mauled the picket lines. Finally, the CIA psychological warfare team prepared pamphlets, radio broadcasts, and posters aimed at discouraging workers from continuing the strike. Some of the Psy-War team's maneuvers were inspired. At one point, the American government threatened to ship 65,000 sacks of flour meant for the hungry city back to the United States unless the dockers unloaded them immediately. The pressure of violence and hunger was too great, and on December 9th, Marseille's workers abandoned the strike, along with their fellow workers in the rest of France. There were some ironic finishing touches. On Christmas Eve of 1947, 87 boxcars arrived at the Marseille train station carrying flour, milk, sugar, and fruit as gifts from the American people, unquote, amidst the cheers of hundreds of school children waving tiny American flags. The Guerinis gained enough power and status from their role in smashing the 1947 strike to emerge as the new leaders of the Corsican underworld. But while the CIA was instrumental in restoring the Corsican underworld's political power, it was not until the 1950 dock strike that the Guerinis gained enough power to take control of the Marseille waterfront. This combination of political influence and control of the docks created the perfect environmental conditions for the growth of Marseille's heroin laboratories, fortuitously at exactly the same time that Mafia boss Lucky Luciano was seeking an alternate source of heroin supply.
So again, we see where the growth of the heroin trade is inextricably linked with the use by intelligence, specifically the CIA, which has just been created, the use of intelligence's use of underworld gangs, the very people who deal in heroin, as political hitmen to prevent the rise of any sort of alternative or leftist governments in Europe immediately post-World War II.
Of course, this was exactly the role that we saw the Sicilian Mafia installed in by the OSS and AMGOT in Italy and in Sicily.
Continuing now. The same austere economic conditions that had sparked the 1947 strike also produced the 1950 shutdown. Conditions for the workers had not improved in the intervening 3 years and, if anything, had grown worse. Marseille, with its tradition of working-class militancy, had even more reason for striking. Marseille was France's gateway to the Orient, through which material, particularly American munitions and supplies, was transported to the French Expeditionary Corps fighting in Indochina. The Indochina was about as unpopular with the French people then as the Vietnam War is with so many of the American people today. By the way, for those of you who are our younger listeners or are not real familiar with history, the Indochina War was France being thrown out of Vietnam. It is the Vietnamese War. It's just the first part of the Vietnamese War. Vietnam was called Indochina in those days. The Indochina War was about as unpopular with the French people as the Vietnam War is with so many American people today. This was written in 1972. And Ho Chi Minh had helped to found the French Communist Party and was a popular hero in France among the leftist working-class members, especially in Marseille with its many resident Indo-Chinese. In January, Marseille dock workers began a selective boycott of those freighters carrying supplies to the war zone. And on February 3rd, the CGT convened a meeting of Marseille dock workers at which a declaration was issued demanding, quote, the return of the Expeditionary Corps from Indochina to put an end to the war in Vietnam, and urging, quote, all unions to launch the most effective actions possible against the war in Vietnam, unquote. The movement of arms shipments to Indochina was paralyzed. Although the Atlantic ports joined in the embargo in early February, they were not as effective or as important as the Marseille strike. By mid-February, the shutdown had spread to the metal industries, the mines, and the railways. But most of the strikes were half-hearted. On February 18th, the Paris newspaper Combat reported that Marseille was once again the hardcore. 70% of Marseille's workers supported the strike compared to only 2% in Bordeaux, 20% in Toulouse, and 20% in Nice. Once more, Marseille's working-class militancy called for special methods, and the CIA's Thomas Braden later recalled how he dealt with the problem. Quote, "On the desk in front of me as I write these lines is a creased and faded yellow paper. It bears the following inscription in pencil. Quote, received from Warren G. Haskins, $15,000, signed Norris A. Grambo," unquote. I went in search of this paper on the day the newspapers disclosed the, quote, "scandal" of the Central Intelligence Agency's connections with American students and labor leaders. It was a wistful search, and when it ended, I found myself feeling sad. For I was Warren G. Haskins. Norris A. Grambo was Irving Brown of the American Federation of Labor. The $15,000 was from the vaults of the CIA, and the yellow paper is the last memento I possess of a vast and secret operation. It was my idea to give $15,000 to Irving Brown. He needed it to pay off his strong-armed squads in the Mediterranean ports, so that American supplies could be unloaded against the opposition of communist dock workers," unquote. With the CIA's financial backing, Brown used his contacts with the underworld and a, quote, rugged, fiery Corsican, unquote, named Pierre Ferri Pisani to recruit an elite criminal terror squad to work the docks. Surrounded by his gangster hirelings, Ferri Pisani stormed into local communist headquarters and threatened to make the party's leadership, quote, pay personally for the continuing boycott. And, as Time magazine noted with great satisfaction, quote, "the first communist who tried to fire Ferri Pisani's men was chucked into the harbor," unquote. In addition, the Guarini's gangsters were assigned the job of pummeling communist picket lines to allow troops and scabs onto the docks, where they could begin loading munitions and supplies. By March 13th, government officials were able to announce that, despite a continuing boycott by communist workers, 900 dockers and supplementary troops had restored normal operations on the Marseille waterfront. Although sporadic boycotts continued until mid-April, Marseille was now subdued and the strike was essentially over. But there were unforeseen consequences of these Cold War, quote, victories. In supplying the Corsican syndicates with money and support, the CIA broke the last barrier to unrestricted Corsican smuggling operations in Marseille. When control over the docks was compounded with the political influence the milieu gained with CIA assistance in 1947, conditions were ideal for Marseille's growth as America's heroin laboratory. The French police later reported that Marseille's first heroin laboratories were opened in 1951, only months after the milieu took over the waterfront. Gaston Defferre and the Socialist Party also emerged victorious after the 1947 and 1950 strikes weakened the local Communist Party. From 1953 until the present, the Socialists, Defferre and the Socialists, have enjoyed an unbroken political reign over the Marseille municipal government. The Guarinis seem to have maintained a relationship with Marseille's socialists. Members of the Guarini organization acted as bodyguards and campaign workers for local socialist candidates until the family's downfall in 1967.